Hi. We are so fucking back. Oh, hello. I had some pretty big plans on what I wanted the next marathon to be now that we're done with Sonic. I wanted to continue looking through Crash with the PS2 entries, and I also wanted to revisit Devil May Cry as those old videos are starting to really smell bad. But then here comes Nintendo with a Nintendo Direct with a ton of killer games like Mario & Luigi, a new Zelda, Mario Party, Donkey Kong Country, Returns, a Marvel vs. Capcom re-release, and then, at the very end, what the fuck? Where's Nintendogs? Oh my god, Metroid Prime 4, it's real, I can see it, it exists! What the hell am I supposed to do with all this clown makeup? But I'm not ready for this. I mean, I've only ever beaten Prime 1, even though I've spent over $100 on both Prime 2 and Prime Trilogy together, because that's what someone who owns this would do! And that's not even to mention the handheld games. I mean, I've never even seen gameplay of Federation Force, or even a copy in person. So on a whim, I decided Sonic's over, it's the perfect time to get back to Metroid with the Prime series, and also Other M, because when else am I going to look at it? With that being said, let's get started with Metroid Prime. While Mario and Zelda were growing up with their 3D debuts on the Nintendo 64, Metroid would miss out on this generation completely. The wait between Super Metroid and Metroid Prime, and Fusion for that matter since they released on the same day, was longer than the wait between Metroid 1 and 2. And for multiple reasons. Not only was Nintendo struggling with ideas on translating a Metroid game to the N64 controller, it just won't do! But there was also the pressure of being a follow-up to Super Metroid, the magnum opus of the series to many. But you gotta make a new game at some point. Fans would definitely prefer a new game that isn't as good as Super Metroid over never getting a new game because we already peaked, and with everyone else doing 3D, Mario and Zelda went in completely different directions, so how would they do a Metroid game since its inception was as a mix of both styles, the platforming from Mario and the non-linearity of Zelda? Well, we wouldn't know until the Gamecube. In fact, we didn't get anything Metroid related until 2002, where we would get Metroid Fusion, and on the same day, the long-awaited 3D Metroid game, Metroid Prime, a collaboration between Nintendo R&D 1 and Retro Studios, a studio that focused on the GameCube's mature audience. Because the founder, Jeff Spangenberg, was part of Iguana Entertainment, which did the same for the N64. Miyamoto visited their office once and was impressed by a prototype they had made for a first-person shooter, and suggested that they make a Metroid game. Jeff, however, wouldn't actually be part of this though, as he was fired for constantly not showing up to work, and he was using Retro service to host websites of, and I quote, scantily clad women. I need to quote that, I just think that's a funny way of saying he was hosting websites with boob in it. To wrap up Jeff's story, because I just think it's that interesting, he would make another company that would only ever make one game, that being the Guy game. You know, I wasn't fully convinced of the story about him using Retro servers for inappropriate websites. I first heard the story on Twitter, so I knew it was very possibly misinformation. But knowing that he would go on to make this definitely makes it more believable. I guess because researching it myself wasn't enough. What a way to start talking Metroid. At a glance, taking Metroid into a first-person shooter would seem like their attempt at Halo, and I wonder how fans felt when they revealed the game would be in first person. I wouldn't be surprised if they also thought this was gonna be just another attempt at capturing the attention of Halo fans. It must have been especially scary since it had been so long since the last game. But Michael Kelbaugh, who would become the Retro Studios president after Prime's release, said they didn't want to make another first-person shooter to throw into the ring, as they felt that that would be cheap, and instead wanted to fully capture the themes and concept of the past Metroid games just in 3D, and they picked first-person because they thought that felt more immersive. And you can tell they did their homework, because in a lot of ways this game is like a 3D take on Super Metroid. Taking place between Metroid 1 and 2, the game opens with Samus getting a distress signal from a nearby space pirate station that has been overrun with their own experiments, murdering them all. The place is in ruin, everyone's dead, and the monsters that were being studied are escaping. After killing the big one, the place starts self-destructing, and on her way out, Samus encounters a cybernetic Ridley, which sort of explains his sudden reappearance in Super. During her escape, Samus is caught in an explosion that nerfs her back to having no items, then she escapes to pursue Meta Ridley on the planet Talon 4. She loses track of him and goes down to continue searching on foot. One of the first new features the Prime series introduces is the Scan Visor, a mode where you can scan an enemy or object to get a description of it. A lot of the entries don't matter, but the ones that do are put into your research and creature logs. Something I like is how with the Parasite Queen, for example, the lock-on target is originally on its chest, but once you scan it, it tells you the weakness is in its mouth, which causes the lock-on to switch, telling you that you can scan enemies and bosses to find the proper strategy to beat them. You also need the Scan Visor to activate certain things like force fields and elevators, meaning you could spend a lot of time in the Scan Visor, which sucks because you can't shoot or do anything but scan, and going for 100% scans can be hell because of how many things you can just straight up miss. Some enemies you think are repeats of ones you already scanned are actually brand new entries, or how about needing to scan spider tracks and grapple points before and after getting the upgrades to let you use them because they're two separate entries. Though I'd say it balances out since you're often rewarded for being diligent with scans. Not only do you learn the weaknesses of enemies, but some of these turrets that you find in the space pirate facilities can be completely deactivated, meaning you don't have to waste time fighting them. The story is also mostly told through the Scan Visor. You find space pirate logs that explain what they're doing on this planet in the first place, and Chozo lore entries about the Chozo that lived here before they went extinct. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, because on one hand I appreciate how they don't stop the game to tell you story, you can just keep moving on if you want. The problem is that I don't want to stop and read the lore, and it doesn't help that I can't read in the first place. So pretty much everything I say about the story is going to be based on the Wikipedia article's story section. If you don't like it, you can leave. Or just skip till I start talking more about the gameplay. Or just put up with it. I'm not your dad. While exploring the planet, you find the remains of the Chozo that used to live here before a meteor crashed into the planet and infested it with this substance called Phazon. Venturing deeper into the planet, Samus finds space pirate research facilities where they're studying Metroids and using the planet's resources as fuel. They're also conducting experiments with the Phazon from the planet, culminating in the experiments crossing over, with the pirates believing that a creature that was on the meteor that brought the Phazon was still in the impact crater, the Metroid Prime. Going deeper into the pirates' Phazon mining operation, we see how fucked up the results can be. Firstly, Phazon is all over the place, completely swarming it, and the pirates that have been experimented on can absorb it. Samus eventually finds an artifact temple near where she landed that was built to contain the Metroid Prime by sealing off the impact crater, and that the Chozo artifacts hidden throughout the planet were keys to opening it so she can go in and finish the job now that her suit is Phazon proof. Once she gathers the artifact, she's ambushed by Ridley, who was probably waiting for her to open the impact crater for him so the pirates can have access to more Phazon and the Metroid Prime. But Samus wins the fight, because how many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man? When she gets in the crater, she fights off the Metroid Prime until it has to shed its skin, in which she just does it again, this time with a stronger beam. The Metroid Prime starts exploding and steals her Phazon suit, but Samus escapes the crater and leaves the planet. But if you get all the items, which I didn't, you get one last scene where the Metroid Prime reforms itself into a new form resembling Samus. You know, I didn't realize how much of this game I already knew just through basic observations. Well, yeah, the Chozo lore and pirate log spell it out for you. You can understand a solid chunk of this game just by observing your surroundings. I mean, the only thing that would really be a surprise is the Metroid Prime and the impact crater and maybe the point of the artifacts. But with how hazardous the Phazon is, and with the monster that pollutes the water in Chozo ruins, it can be assumed that Phazon was in some way part of why the Chozo aren't around anymore. And with some basic observations, you can tell the space pirates have been harvesting and experimenting with Phazon. Though, in the original, I wouldn't really blame you for not observing your surroundings all that much. The right stick does all of your moving. You have to hold L to lock on if you want to strafe, and you have to hold R if you want to aim up or down. Usually the lock-on is generous enough to where you don't have to worry about vertical aiming, but it fails just enough to be noticeable. It's at its worst with this invisible sentry bot. It's invisible so you can't lock onto it, and it's in the air so you have to hold R to aim up at it. But you can't move while holding R, and if you let go of it or the stick without pressing L to lock your aim in place, it goes back to eye level. That mixed with how this thing gives you practically no feedback to if you're actually hitting it, and the last save being pretty far away makes this fight something I loathe every time I replay this game. The way the camera works also makes platforming a bitch, since there's no good way to see what you're landing on while still moving, and because the movement is so restrictive, it's easy to get stuck during fights, getting comboed in the corner while you try to figure out where you even are. The rest of the game is pretty much exactly what you'd expect a 3D Metroid game to be like. There are a few changes to old abilities for obvious reasons, like the spider ball you can only go up these tracks, and space jump only gives you a double jump, both clearly to keep you from breaking the game, and to keep you from needing to spider ball every nook and cranny looking for where to go. The beams are also now different. Once again, they don't stack, but it's because they're all treated as separate weapons, with you switching on the fly now using the C-stick. The wave beam stuns enemies now, and it's the only way you can kill these floating orbs or power up doors. Yeah, the wave beam doesn't go through walls, except for these specific times where it needs to because the power source to open a door is hidden. I usually completely switch to the wave beam once I get it. For one, it's the only beam that can open all of the doors available, at least until you get the ice beam, but the stun a charge shot gives mixed with a missile makes space pirates chumps. Until I get Ice Beam, I only ever switch back to Power Beam for super missiles or the few enemies that are immune to everything else. Oh yeah, I guess keeping with the trend of fusion, super missiles aren't a separate item anymore. This time it's an upgrade to the Power Beam. You charge up a shot then fire a missile, and now it's a super missile at the cost of 5 regular missiles. These have homing properties and definitely feel way more powerful, but I usually prefer to save my missiles or do this trick with the power beam where you can rapid fire regular missiles skipping the reload animation. The wave beam also gets its own version of super missiles, though it's a bitch to get because you need to shoot these weakened blocks that have enemies on them. They're too high to hit without aiming a little up, but you can't press L to lock the shot there because it'll lock onto the enemy which blocks your shot, which really emphasizes the problem with the aiming controls I mentioned earlier. But once you get it, it's alright. It completely stuns an enemy in place and kills them, but it drains missiles like a bitch. I only ever use this on these wave beam exclusive enemies or the Metroid Prime when it's vulnerable to wave beam. The ice beam pretty much replaces the wave once I get it though, since being able to freeze enemies makes encounters non-issues. It even freezes the gun when you charge it up, which is neat, and I like looking at it. My only issue is now there are times where I have to switch beams just to open a door. I don't know why they didn't make these like the missile doors where once you open it with the weapon you need, it just becomes a normal door that can be opened with everything. But if you thought the wave beam missile combo was good, freezing enemies and then shattering them with the missile is just awesome. And since charge shots in this game give a small area of effect, you can make entire rooms of threats a joke. I also pretty much never use its missile move. I don't even know what it's called and I almost forgot to get it in this playthrough. Once again, I mainly use it on the Metroid Prime during its ice phase because it's very high damaging. I guess that's the thing with all of these abilities, is they do a lot of damage at the cost of a lot of missiles that probably would have killed in less shots, so they never really feel worth it outside of boss fights. The last beam you get is the Plasma Beam. It's super powerful and can melt ice in some places. It also sets enemies on fire, but I mainly use it because it does a shit ton of damage. A lot of enemies go down in a couple of charge shots. Hell, the Omega Pirate can be shredded with this thing, just look at it! And keeping with the trend, its super missile variant is also very underwhelming. It's a flamethrower, and I think I only used it once to show it off, if I even know where that footage is in the first place. That's it. I don't know why you'd waste this many missiles when the regular beam is already so good. I like all of the beams, but I wish they were more different. Like I said, the new beam I got pretty much always replaced the old one except for when the game forces me to use something else. And not by playing to the other beam's strengths or weaknesses, but just by making every beam outside of a specific one utterly useless against an enemy, kind of making an artificial necessity to switch. At least the grapple beam isn't a separate beam like in Super, you just lock onto grapple points and it does it for you. Adding on to the basic arsenal are thermal and x-ray visors. These kind of only exist for a few puzzles and enemies. There are never moments where you're not forced to use these that I feel like it would be worthwhile switching. It kind of just fixes minor inconveniences for one enemy each. But even though it's better, the enemies are more than killable with the regular visor, and they're not very common encounters, so it's easy to forget that you even have a visor that'll just make it easier. But man, the boost ball? This is amazing. If jump ball were an upgrade, then boost balling around would be the best way to get around. There's not much platforming here, it's mostly just exploring areas and figuring out how to get around, and I think the exploration in this game is some of the best in the series as a whole. While I don't really pay attention to how many of the items I get, you're rewarded heavily by just being thorough. Like man, they shower you in missiles. Outside of energy tanks and the 2 power bomb expansions I found, every other upgrade was missile expansions. You'd think I'd stop being so stingy with supers. And if you're at a point where you're lost, the game will eventually show you where on the map you should be headed. This thing is impatient as fuck though, like man, I'm in the middle of something, I'll get to it eventually. Hell, one time it happened when I was just like a room away doing the puzzle I needed to open the door. But I think it's great, it's only intrusions a few seconds and you can turn it off. It helps if you're a little out of whack, like maybe you haven't played the game in a while. I know for my run I ended up doing things a little out of order, which disoriented me a little bit, so it was helpful to be reassured even if I was on the right track. The environments are also engaging to explore, there's such a variety that every place stands out. You could show me a random screenshot from the map and I could probably explain exactly where it is. Don't test that though. The only area I don't like is the Phazon Mines. It's just kind of tedious to get around, it's home with a stupid security drone, a lot of elevators. Like a lot of elevators. There is so much waiting on elevators. But other than that, the place just kind of drags. And it's also where I start getting sick of the few platforming sessions with enemies. There's a little knockback, but since movement is so restrictive, sometimes you get hit by enemies you didn't even know existed, and you need to climb your ass all the way back up, and it's just not fun, even if it's a super short climb. This game isn't much longer than your standard Metroid affair, and the only challenging parts are really the boss fights, which there is a surprising lack of. There are only 4 bosses that I can think of that have actual health bars, the rest being mini-bosses and sometimes just becoming regular enemies. The last thing I'll say is I don't like the artifacts. You need to get all of them to get into the impact crater, which is basically this game's Turian, and it just means that after you get the Phazon suit, you need to go back through every area and find them. It's not that finding them is hard, the hints in the logbook are actually extremely helpful, but this is basically just a wall that says now you need to go back and find a bunch of shit that you'd have had no clue you should have been looking for in the first place. It's annoying. You can get these early, but who on their first playthrough would even know to be looking for them? They might find 1 or 2 on their own, but this just extends the game for no reason. But for the first 3D Metroid game, this game is fantastic. From the atmosphere of Talon 4 being my favorite planet in the series, the varied areas, rewarding exploration, it has all the makings of a Metroid game just from a new perspective. The only thing I would change is the camera controls. I get the choice of having a C-stick be set for beams so you can switch quickly, but I'd trade it for better aiming with a second analog stick. And it's a good thing that version of the game exists. If you haven't played Metroid Prime Remastered, then what's wrong with you? It's fucking perfect. The movement feels better, you can play with classic controls if you want, but it has twin stick aiming which feels so good. It saves scans if you're replaying from a save file that already beat the game. It gives you Jump Ball, which was exclusive to the Wii version, and I'll look at that along with Prime 3. But if you're going to play this game, play the remaster. I am praying that Prime 2 and 3 get this treatment because this turns a fantastic game into a masterpiece. Metroid Prime is an amazing start to the Prime series. It did everything it needed to do, while not straying too far away and possibly scaring fans away. You could say it's a prime example of how good the series could be. It really is just a 3D take on Super Metroid, an opening with a space station in ruin and crashing. Most of the items are from Super. Hell, the music in the Magmore Caverns is just the Lower Norfair theme. I think it makes the first game the closest to the 2D games out of the Prime series, making it the perfect starting point. Because even though I haven't played them much, I do know that the sequels stray a lot further away from the standard Metroid formula than the first game did. But do they still capture the Metroid feeling? Guess we'll find out next time when we look at Metroid Prime 2 Echoes. I've played a little bit of this one, but not a whole lot, so we'll see what I was missing out on. Until then, I hope you have a great day, a beautiful morning, an awesome night, and I'll see you next mission.